Welcome to Advanced EU EUA podcast series and our third episode dedicated to the conditionality mechanisms within the Ukraine facility and their relevance for accession-related reforms in Ukraine. Today we have with us Matthias Thiemann, full professor for European Public Policy at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po University, and Iana Okhrimenko, senior economist at the Center for Economic Strategy in Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome you both. Matthias, the European Union's overall financial support to Ukraine from the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion estimates to be close to 200 billion euros, including 50 billion euros under the Ukraine Facility mechanism, which is structured around three pillars: budgetary support, so-called Ukraine Plan, Ukraine Investment Framework, and various assistance programs providing capacity-building support to national authorities and civil society in strategic sectors. The first pillar, which is Ukraine Plan, is directly linked to the EU accession-related reforms. Could you please tell us, in your own words, how one should perceive this specific instrument? Is it truly one-of-a-kind financial instrument in the history of EU financial tools, taking into account its specific focus, amount and structure? And what conditionality is actually attached to the Ukraine Facility Plan?
Marta, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure being here. Your question on the reform plan. The Ukraine plan is indeed a new tool of conditionality that the EU has implemented. It is new in the sense that it brings together many old elements of conditionality and combines it with a very clear temporal framework that is quarterly, whereby the Ukrainian government is asked to implement 130 reform steps that are evaluated on a quarterly basis, and that is linked to direct disbursement. That is to say, officially, at least, the EU has the right to withhold payment or to suspend payment if it finds that the reforms are not properly implemented. The Ukraine plan itself, which is very much inspired by the Recovery and Resilience Facility national plans, has been negotiated between the EU and the Ukrainian government. In that sense, it's also a plan that is very much owned by the Ukrainian government. So it's very difficult for the Ukrainian government to argue that these are externally imposed plans. It has a very clear goal, which is to allow Ukraine to access the European Union at some point. And as such, I think it is really a unique tool. But at the same time, I think we will see this template being much more implemented in the other accession countries, which already from 2024 onwards have similar national investment plans that also have these reform requests that are evaluated on a quarterly basis.
The Ukraine facility combines enlargement policy with investment governance and blended finance mechanisms. Matthias, building on that, does this fundamentally change the nature of EU conditionality? And to which extent does the Ukraine facility shift conditionality from traditional acquis-based approximation of national laws to governance structure?
Thank you. That's a very, very, very concrete question. So I think what we first have to appreciate is that in the past, these kind of negotiations over compliance with certain acquis-related reforms was on a somewhat loose temporal basis. That is to say, you do not deliver, we don't give you any money, but there was no clear temporal understanding as to when reforms have to be implemented. And now that is very much different. There is a very clear expectation as to when certain reforms have to be implemented, and there is an ongoing evaluation effort, both by the government, Ukrainian government, and the EU to see if these reforms are moving forward. So I think that's the first thing we can observe is that there is much more speed in this process, whereas before this was a much looser process, which was when you deliver, we will also deliver, but there was no temporal timeline. The second thing is you mentioned that there's also an investment aspect, which is true because also the Ukraine investment framework is linked to certain of these reforms, which in practice, however, is a bit more difficult because the day-to-day work of these development banks, I can hardly see that really being impacted by these large-scale macro reforms and their negotiation, unless the judicial reform and the anti-corruption efforts that we will, I think, speak about. But what we really do see is much more of an active engagement of the EU seeking to help move Ukraine in the direction of EU accession. And I think, of course, we haven't spoken about this yet, the war situation and the need for macro-financial assistance plays a big role, both in the positive sense that there is an urgency to the matter, but then there's also the problem of conditionality and when and how to implement conditionality in a condition of war, where the country needs these sources to keep afloat. And I think that's something that we'll get to as we continue our conversation. Thank you.
Iana, the Ukraine facility plan targets a broad range of reforms through its conditionality mechanism. Which reforms are specifically targeted by this conditionality, and how would you assess their importance for Ukraine at this particular moment? And also stepping back, how successful has the linkage between financial disbursements and reform implementation actually been in practice so far, taking into account that quite recently already the seventh tranche under the Ukraine facility was disbursed?
Thank you, Marta, for inviting me, and thank you for starting with such an interesting question. So yeah, the discussion is going to be interesting from the very beginning. To answer your first question, there are many reforms covered by the plan. Not to list all of them, we can say that there are three broad groups of these reforms. So of course we have fundamentals, like those which are mostly related to cluster one of accession negotiations. So basically public administration reform, budget oversight, judiciary, and so on and so forth. Then we have a set of, let's say, more economy and market-oriented reforms. So they are mostly related to, modernization, deregulation, improved regulation for specific sectors, and so on. And last but not least, there is a set of reforms which are implemented to make sure that recovery and rebuilding money are used properly. So, for instance, here we can mention public investment management reform and similar reforms.
Iana, do you see the conditionality mechanism introduced by the facility as a driving force pushing Ukraine's EU accession forward, or does it risk becoming an obstacle?
So when it comes to conditionality mechanism, I would say that it works, but probably not as effectively as initially expected. We have this kind of sequential gain problem when everyone is aware how critical European financing for Ukraine is. And since everyone is aware of this, our European partners are pretty flexible when it comes to financing. So I just have a pretty good example. The seventh installment is just a perfect example to illustrate what I'm talking about. So Ukraine got money. However, when it comes to reforms, only 11 out of 20 reforms have been successfully implemented. I'm talking about the reforms attached specifically to this seventh installment. So we got some money for implementing the overdue reforms, which is fine. It's according to the initially set rules. However, we also got some financing attached to the reforms which were implemented ahead of schedule. And it's something which was not to happen under the initial rules. So obviously, Ukraine is in desperate need for European financing, and everyone is aware of this. And keeping this in mind, probably European Union is more flexible than it should be in order to make this commitment more credible.
Thank you. And could you please elaborate maybe a bit more which exact conditionalities were not fulfilled that were attached to this tranche by Ukraine, and which ones, as you said, were over fulfilled?
Reforms related both to fundamentals, as far as I can recall, public administration reform, and there were also some reforms related to specific sectors, such as financial markets, for instance. So it's impossible to say that there is one particular group that causes most of problems. Actually, the performance varies across different sectors, spheres of these reforms.
Thank you for this elaboration. Let's hope that Ukraine will continue overperforming rather than underperforming the necessary reforms attached to the plan in order to get the next disbursement and also to foster its integration path. Iana, the Ukraine facility also sets a specific timeline for concluding reforms in order for Ukraine to be able to receive the next disbursements under the plan. How realistic are the benchmarks and timelines attached to these disbursement conditions, in your opinion, given also the wartime context?
Set of reforms was formulated, and Ukraine has a substantial part of ownership in this. So, it's not something that was imposed by the European partners. And I must admit that many reforms were formulated deliberately in the way so they could be easily implemented, considering that, financing is attached to these reforms. So I will give you examples. For instance, we are not talking about proper implementation of the European legislation. Like, we are talking about adopting laws, creating strategies, launching registries, and there is no requirement to make this work properly. So, but even considering, that some reforms had this simplistic character, we face some obstacles, even though those timelines, in my opinion, are pretty realistic. So there are two main problems on our side. First of all, when it comes to members of parliament, not everyone fully realizes that financing is attached to implementing reforms and how crucial this financing is for Ukraine right now. And the second thing is that our government often fails to communicate the importance of those reforms properly. So this is just a Euro integration reform, and this should be enough, but this is not enough. So there is no proper communication and no proper explanation regarding how this should work, what is the overall objective of this, and so on and so forth. For instance, I can give you an example. So, Parliament has registered a draw bill regarding the set of actions that should bring us closer to the single euro payment area membership. And the list of actions included creating a registry of bank accounts for individuals. And we all know that this is a pretty standard practice in the European Union. Those registries exist in literally every member of the European Union. However, in Ukraine, this created a lot of, many public discussions, which are pretty unnecessary. And again, it's really hard to explain that we need to create this registry so we have better AML regulations, so we have overall lower systemic risk in the country. And considering this, like the payments between Ukraine and other countries which are members of the single euro payment area can be faster and cheaper. But again, there was nothing like this, you know. So we really lack this kind of proper government, parliament communication, and I think this is one of the major bottlenecks when it comes to implementing the reforms of Ukraine plan.
Throughout the last years, we could observe cases of democratic backsliding inside the European Union that has evoked a dilemma of so-called enlargement fatigue, highlighting the necessity of the long-lasting effect of the reforms in EU candidate countries, including those in Ukraine. Iana, in your opinion, how can the EU and Ukraine avoid a situation of formal so-called visionary compliance with accession benchmarks without actual substantive institutional transformation, including such fundamental elements of well-functioning democratic state as strong judiciary and anti-corruption mechanisms?
This risk is exaggerated. So far as I can see, most of reforms which were properly implemented, they have this long-lasting character. So we can definitely see their effects right now. Overall, I think that EU conditionality should focus not only on, transposing legislation, but more on proper implementation to make sure that everything is functioning properly, that everything is reflected in budgeting and procedures and so on and so forth. So probably this is something that we lack. And but again, considering that we have problems even with less sophisticated reforms, I'm not sure that it could actually be feasible.
How would you assess the level of integration of the reforms required under the Ukraine facility into Ukraine's EU accession roadmap that just celebrated in May 1 year since its adoption?
Overall, I think that those reforms, they actually reflect many of the recommendations of the European Commission, and most of them are designed specifically to, bring Ukraine closer to adopting the EU acquis. But sometimes in Ukraine, this creates some kind of confusion. How can this be a Euro integration reform when there is no financing attached to this reform, So again, when we talk about the example I brought previously, single Euro payment area, it's super important in my opinion. It's directly related to Chapter 4, free movement of capital. It could bring enormous benefits to Ukrainian business and consumers. But as far as, it's not discussed in terms of getting some financing from the European Union, its importance is underestimated, which is weird in my opinion.
Matthias, coming back to you, can you tell us more about how the funds of Ukraine facility are disbursed and who is behind the scenes and decides what to finance or not to finance?
So first of all, Iana, thank you very much for these clarifications. They're really helpful, and I agree that the risk of formal compliance without any substantive compliance is really crucial to be avoided. Yeah, and the EU actually needs to spend a lot of also intellectual brain power and institutional power to make sure that there is actually real compliance, and I think that's a crucial problem. So I would like to go into this a little bit before I answer your question on who makes the real decisions and so on. So one is there needs to be, on the one hand, the civil society support for these reforms, and we can ask ourselves and question how such support can be organized. I mean, it was, I think, a huge relief for everyone in Europe, but also in Ukraine, to see how strong the civil society mobilization was last summer, when there was this backsliding on reforms. And that was an important moment that shows you that it really the impetus, the force really comes from inside the country. Okay, that's the first, and that's where a lot of thinking needs to go into it, how they can be facilitated. And that also relates to the backsliding question that you asked. I think we see in countries like Romania, when certain backsliding was prevented, it was even after EU accession, it was really based on civil society mobilization. But for that, really, I think in terms of political science, we're really just at the beginning. We don't know enough about what conditions this kind of like support, how do you keep people engaged with these reforms, which sometimes can seem very technical, and what do they engage on. And so I think, and the second element that I wanted to bring in is, as we are moving forward towards a system possibly that will be one where we will not have yet full membership of Ukraine, but Ukraine will also not be fully outside of the EU. That's something that the Germans are bringing up. We might also think about involving people like Madame Koveshi from the Anti-Corruption Office in Brussels in these efforts. Okay, there could be a way for the EU even to engage more with these kind of reforms. For example, with the DG reform. Yeah, DG Reforms, Director General of Reform in Brussels, and currently it operates only with membership countries mostly. But I think there could really be an opening up that could help also the Ukrainian government to implement these reforms. Now, and who makes the decisions behind the scenes? I mean, look, you would be surprised how small the team is in Brussels that deals with this. And when we spoke to the people in Brussels, they justified that fact with that much of it is actually delegated to the IMF. So much of the reform supervision is actually with the IMF, because the IMF is also engaged with the problem due to their loan that they have. So that's one. The second one, I mean, if you're referring to who decides over the investment decisions, because I mean, there's the macro financial assistance package, and that I think is really just given to the Ukrainian government to implement. Yeah. So when they disperse this money, that's then for the Ukrainians to spend. And then there's Ukraine investment framework, where you have a constant negotiation between the Ukrainian government, the development banks like the European Investment Bank and the European Commission, as to where the money should go. And there they have shown an amazing amount of flexibility, seeking to accommodate the short-term needs of the Ukrainian government in the context of war. Just to give you an example, they've invested the money to allow Naftogaz to buy gas for the winter last year. And that, of course, was not at all foreseen in the investment plans, but they found a construct that they could justify giving that money now for gas by arguing that in the future, Naftogaz will use the receipts from that money to invest in green infrastructure investment. So that is where these behind-the-scenes decisions are made. But as I already said, and as Iana rightly said, there is this repeated consequential game going on, where the real problem becomes the one where anyway you cannot act differently. So I think the current situation with the war makes that the space of maneuver, the discretion of the European officials to decide to withhold money, is often very much constrained by the financing needs of Ukraine, and that's a real problem. It's one that we cannot wish away, but it's one way that we need to take into account. And I think, we can maybe discuss this also. Thank you.
Sure. Following up on this, in your recently published article, The Rise of European Enlargement State, Blended Finance, Development Banks, and the New Modalities of EU Accession, which we, by the way, highly recommend to our audience, you note that many investment decisions are being effectively negotiated by the European Commission and development banks, with Ukraine having limited influence. Do you see this as a well-functioning coordination mechanism or as a governance imbalance?
I think so. Since I wrote that, which is now 1.5 years ago, I've continued with my investigation, and I think actually that there is a quite good degree of interaction between the Ukrainian government, the large Ukrainian state-owned enterprises such as Naftogaz, and the development banks. And so what we observed then in practice since then is a lot of negotiations where even the development banks might ally with the Ukrainian government to suggest investments to the European Union. I think the real governance imbalance that I currently see, and that's related to a larger topic, is the centralization of investment decisions. So you have large state-owned enterprises, you have the central government in Ukraine, and all of that seeks to determine where investment should go, and all of that makes sense in a situation of war. But in the end, what we will need, what Ukraine might need to sustain the reforms is local actors that support the EU accession and the integration into EU as a project. And that can only happen when you have more local engagement on the level of Romadas. And for that, you could argue that currently maybe it's not the moment because you need quick decision making and so on. But in the longer run, I see this as possibly the greatest danger, that you end up with a country that is very centralized and where there are very few beneficiaries, much like in Orban's Hungary, and very many that don't feel any connection to the European Union or the project as it unfolds.
Thank you, Matthias. Really interesting observation, and really important that you've mentioned the topic of decentralization that has been on the top of reforms list in Ukraine over 10 years already, since its official launch in 2014. That was even before the full-scale invasion, and now again is mentioned as a vital for aligning with the EU accession reforms and integrating Ukraine's post-war recovery and reconstruction, with, as you've rightly mentioned, Romadas as its main driving force. Iana, one may argue that investment-driven conditionality mechanisms, including the Ukraine facility, favor only certain critical sectors, namely energy, transport, and infrastructure. In your opinion, does this put institutional reforms in danger? And could you please tell us, based on the data and research conducted by the Center for Economic Strategy, which sectors or regions have benefited most from these investments?
Actually, I think it makes perfect sense, considering the fact that Ukrainian economy is not as diversified compared to the European Union, for instance. So yeah, we have several critical sectors like agriculture. We have several sectors which are in the greatest need for financing, considering constant ongoing reconstruction efforts, like energy, for instance, and infrastructure. And it just makes sense. I can hardly imagine how this, can be interpreted as a threat for democratic institutions, because I do not know. I'm not sure whether it creates some unfair market advantages for certain groups, at least at this point. So just to summarize, investment goes to sectors which are most visible, important, and can provide the greatest return on investment during the wartime. And so far, it just makes sense for me. However, when it comes to the geographical distribution, things are a bit different. But I wouldn't associate this with drawbacks of Ukraine investment facility or Ukraine plan in general. It's just sad but natural reality for frontline regions, because they are in the greatest need for investment for reconstruction purposes, or, just to keep functioning in those horrible circumstances. However, even when some new instruments to support business in Ukraine are created, frontline regions usually have usually have restricted access to them. For instance, if we talk about wartime insurance mechanism, so it could make it could be most useful in those frontline regions. However, paradoxically, they do not have much access to it. Colleagues, they are in this project for, rebuilding and recovery watchdog, analyzing where financing for recovery and actually goes geographically. And they suggest that frontline regions, in line with the decentralization ideas Matthias mentioned before, they should get some kind of special treatment when it comes to preparing local development projects. Because right now we are in the process of public investment management reform. Decentralization is a huge pillar, and the entire idea is to make development more local oriented, in line with the CPR in the European Union. But hromadas, which are located closer to the front line, they simply have less experience, less resources, even less qualified people to go through all the stages of project application, proper technical and economic expertise, and so on and so forth. So yeah, probably this is like one thing that could help. But I think that the issue is pretty complex, and there are many things to consider, if we want to make geographical distribution of investment more fair.
It's wonderful research that you're doing at the center. I find it important because we have the same findings in Europe, where we don't have a war, evidently, luckily enough, and in European Union, And what happens there is the same, that weak regions have a very hard time accessing any of this financing. So even in France, you find that the weak regions don't access the funding where they need it most, and the rich regions that need it the least access it the most. It's just that in Ukraine, it's on steroids. So I think, but it's a very important shortcoming of this apparatus. The second thing is that I think I agree with you that energy infrastructure and transport are now what is most needed. One needs also, however, to keep in mind that a bank like the European Investment Bank, they do that because it's what they always do, right? The European Investment Bank is this large ticket bank that loves to invest in infrastructure. Why? Because it's super easy. They are protected. They just do what they always do. And we need but as I mentioned earlier, in order to protect reforms and to generate a real social tissue that supports the Ukrainian accession to the EU, you need for people at the local level to benefit, and not only to benefit from highways, but to also benefit from SMEs that employ people and so on. And that's where really it needs to be pushed. Because that's something, so it's like a machine. I think when we think of it, it's a machine, and the EU does try to do that, but it's a machine that will do what it always does best on its own. If you don't push them, they will suggest, for example, the green electrification of Lvov, okay, which is great for the city, but doesn't help Ukraine really when you think about it. But it's great for them because that's what they always do. They will do the same thing in Warsaw. And what I'm trying to say is they basically have a template how to green a city transport, and then they just apply it to the city, right? And it's so there is a real need to push them into regions where they don't feel comfortable, and in areas where they don't feel comfortable. And I think the EU already does quite a bit of that, but it's not yet. It can go even further.
If I may jump in, maybe if you could, both from the perspective of the European Union and from the perspective of Ukraine, you, Matthias, and Iana, give some kind of 3 key steps or bullet points, policy recommendation, how to address these imbalances in financing across different regions. from the side of the European Union and from the side of Ukraine?
I think the first one is to address the problem of addressing the regions that are less that are closer to the front, and that's something that the EU already tries to do, pushing, for example, by using smaller development banks that are experienced in this kind of deal. I think, but the real shortcoming that I find a lot, in particular, I'm working currently on foreign direct investment, is war risk insurance. War risk insurance today, war risk insurance is too small and doesn't allow potential investors to travel to Ukraine. And so that's a problem that can be easily addressed by increasing war risk insurance. Now, I think the second element has to be smart use of the technical assistance money. There are 3 billion or even more, I think, devoted to technical assistance in the Ukraine facility. And one major element has to be to get the Hromadas ready for accessing European funds. And I think that's really my number one recommendation for the Ukrainians is the way that the EU today functions often, and we can see this with Iana's mentioned reforms of cohesion funds, increasingly in more and more domains, is by bundling money and making it into tools for blended finance. And a new country that comes into this has to be capable of accessing it, and that's very difficult. And their money needs to be spent. And maybe we can come up with creative bundling of resources and so on that help local Hromadas to access this money. So that would be the second recommendation that I would have. And the third one, I'll come back later when Iana has said her three.
Well, it's really funny because I do not have anything to add, because when it comes to war risk insurance, we conducted a study for frontline regions, I think like a year and a half ago. And this was exactly like one of the major problems. So first of all, there is simply virtually no war risk insurance for businesses in frontline regions, at least, compared to what is available for businesses located in central and western regions. So yeah, it's definitely a major problem, and I'm not sure whether it needs any additional confirmation, but I definitely confirm what Matthias said regarding this issue. Yes, actually, the second thing is exactly what we actively advocate, to adopt the EU rules. Because, often legislation in Ukraine is not sophisticated enough, even if it's designed to mirror some of the EU rules, not always it's done properly. For instance, we have a methodology for developing a local development strategy for Hromadas. You can definitely see that it contains some elements of CPRs and some broad requirements common for CPRs, but it's simply not good enough, So we actually advocate do not rely on this, check what they have in Poland. For instance, like methodological recommendations in Poland are designed pretty well, and considering how much of cohesion fund financing they get, probably it makes sense, to follow their example rather than follow rules which are currently binding in Ukraine. And like another recommendation, which I mentioned already, but probably it's a good idea, to repeat it once again because we believe it's a valid one. There should be a lot of technical assistance for Hromadas, in terms of preparation of the development strategy, like doing this technical economic expertise. It appeared to be a huge problem, a huge knowledge gap, because formally there are like recommendations developed by the Ministry of Finance. There is a methodology, but this methodology can hardly be used, without like any well-grounded expertise in economics and finance. And for some Hromadas, this is just not the case.
I think the last element that I would have from my side is maybe This is a bit crazy, and it's maybe not a major problem of Ukraine right now, but I've been thinking a lot about to integrate Ukraine into the EU. One good thing could also be to foster the cross-border collaboration and interaction with the neighboring states, namely Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and seek to push there, for a few to push for more cross-border economic tissue. That would be one thing to think about, because I think the more you have that, the more you have people, for example, in Hungary, in Romania, pushing for EU accession. I think it's really important to overcome these boundaries and make Ukraine a real part of the European economic space. That would be my third one. And I think then thereby I have delivered the three bullet points that you asked for.
Thank you, Matthias. Indeed, citizens' engagement and their involvement into the reformed EU enlargement policy that we have now, driven by the European Union's attempts for strategic autonomy, defines to be a very influential tool when one may think also about the potential referendums on EU accession matter, where every vote counts. Also, it is a crucial element of democratic participation upon which the European Union as a whole is built. Building on that, to ensure transparency and avoid the misuse of funds disbursed under such a costly mechanism requires strong monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. Matthias, could you please elaborate on what are the monitoring and verification mechanisms for assessing the use of the funding and Ukraine's reform progress here? And would you say that those mechanisms that are now in place are sufficiently robust and credible?
So when we speak about the macrofinancial assistance, as I mentioned earlier, currently this is mostly delegated to the IMF. And so in terms of European capacity to observe compliance, it can be improved. Okay. In terms of the investment framework, you have principles that were developed in the Western Balkans, because that's where the investment frameworks come from, that are somewhat designed to deal with corruption. And there's principles like the 4I principle when decisions are taken and so on. There can always be more with respect to it, because I think development banks in general are somewhat bad at following up on their programs. Like they are very good at doing the due diligence beforehand, but they're not so very good at going back later and checking, also because it's pretty much not in their business model or their interest, because, I mean, they've delivered the loan, and why would they want to come back and say, oh, we've delivered the loan for something bad or it didn't happen? It's not in their logic, because, right, they want to have the big numbers, the beautiful numbers, we delivered, blah, blah, blah. And so maybe it's not the development banks that should do that, but somebody else. And the problem here is possibly that we're still dealing with a European Union that in this respect is, I don't want to say operating on a shoestring, because that's not fair, but the administrative capacities sometimes are smaller than what they seek to achieve. That would be my view on this.
The European Commission has recently submitted its proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework for the period of 2028-2034, where it proposed a dedicated Ukraine reserve of up to 100 billion euros for a 7-year period. The new 100 billion euro reserve is expected to be channeled through the Global Europe instrument within the multi-annual financial framework and a special instrument, which is Ukraine Reserve, over and above the MFF ceilings to provide more flexibility. While the total volume is higher, some analysis suggests that the annual amount under the new proposals, which is around 13.5-14 billion euro per year, might be lower or comparable to the current front-loaded aid, depending on the final approved structure. The proposed Ukraine reserve shall operate outside the EU's main budgetary ceilings. therefore enabling spending beyond the annual limits when additional priority or crisis-related needs arise, ensuring flexibility in meeting Ukraine's immediate needs. Given the EU's policy priorities and Ukraine needs, the key areas of support will likely include budgetary stability, institutional development, defense capability, and the restoration of critical infrastructure. Taking this into account and assuming this scenario of continued war, do you think that the proposal in its current form accurately reflects and fits Ukraine's needs, also in terms of recovery and reconstruction support? And what would be your recommendations, if there are ones, in adjusting the next MFF?
A few qualifications before I engage in this answer. So the first one is I always want to say careful when you hear something like up to. The European language up to is basically an expression of the desire to engage private capital and all this kind of things. So we really have to be careful and analyze the final structure of what is going to come about, and probably will be another de-risking facility. I think if there will be war or not, and here we are talking about 2028, so that would be horrible. I think it has a major impact on whether and in how far these means will be sufficient. In a recent interview with a development banker from Europe, he put it, I think, rather succinctly. He said, you can roll out a red carpet. If that red carpet leads into a war zone, investors will not walk that red carpet. And so what we urgently need is, we need stability that is forward-looking and that has meaningful security guarantees that will allow foreign direct investment to unfold. I do think that foreign direct investment is needed in conjunction with the continued support by Europe and by other countries. But I can literally only hope that by 2028 we have reached some kind of stability. Because without, I wouldn't know what would be the appropriate amount of money for Ukraine. I mean, that's my current assessment. I really hope that Europe, Ukraine, and the US and Russia somehow come to a conclusion of this conflict that can stabilize the situation for a long time. Because otherwise, I don't know how this can work. I mean, I don't know how Iana sees this, but that's my take on it.
We all hope so. Iana, would you like to reflect on this too?
Well, not really. I would just say that I'm more pessimistic, but it's just me. However, I'm not sure, I'm in a position to comment on when the war is going to end.
So you think it's gonna be for many years?
Well, no, I just don't know. It's my personal view, not connected with the Center for Economic Strategy whatsoever. But I just don't know. It seems to me like I have no reasons to hope it's gonna end in 2026 or 2027. So, we just try to prepare for the worst case scenario, because it's better to be prepared rather than being excessively optimistic.
Yeah.
Always prepare for the worst while still expecting the best. I think it's what's on the mind of Ukrainians now, including myself. Matthias, from the side of our European friends and allies, maybe you have more positive perception of this issue and can bring us more positive assessment.
I don't know. I mean, I think really I'm happy that the Europeans got more engaged, and I think we're reaching a new level of engagement on so many different fronts, militarily and so on. I think the Europeans also will have to play a role in the negotiations. And I'm currently still wondering why the Norwegian foreign minister insists that the Europeans have to have a place at the table, but the Europeans even say they don't want to have a place at the table, which is for me hard to understand. But that's the European view. I think really Europe also needs to diplomatically get very much engaged. But I can be wrong on this. This is just my view.
I could support this.
The final question addressed to both of you to conclude our discussion, hopefully on a more positive note. What do you consider to be, if any, the main bottlenecks that could delay Ukraine's ability to unlock the future Union's financial assistance to Ukraine? And should, in your opinion, the conditionality under the Ukraine facility be adapted further to fit wartime realities and reconstruction pressure? And if yes, in which way?
I think the biggest bottleneck will be would be created if there is a backsliding scene on corruption. I think that there is a big risk, and that's also why I'm so hopeful that the war. I mean, hopeful. It's more like a necessity to me that the war ends, because the political pressure in Europe, I think, regarding the continued need to support Ukraine in the context of war, will grow. And so we're going to have 2027, we're going to have an election year here in France. Short time thereafter, we'll have an election year in Germany. And I expect the far right to politicize this. And so if there were to be any suspicion of large-scale corruption and backsliding on corruption efforts, that would just stop it. I think so. There is a real risk from my perspective on that end. Maybe for me, that's the biggest risk. That's what I would say.
Iana?
Yeah, I would agree in general. I would also call this probably one of the most serious risks when it comes to the side of Ukraine. But something probably less massive on scale, but more important is that we observe the slowdown of reforms. Even operationally, we have so many laws and bylaws to adopt that I'm not sure, how it could be managed, even if things just went smoothly in Ukraine. But considering, this kind of fatigue among the members of the parliament, I do not know whether it's possible. I hope that something is going to happen. Some black swan is going to fly by, and probably this will change. But so far, yeah, this is what seems to be one of the major risks for me.
Let's have one more wrap-up question to both of you again. How would you assess the ability of Ukrainian government to strategically align facility-related reforms with accession priorities? And do you think that these parallel processes may create some kind of fragmentation? And if yes, how to avoid it? If you could briefly present it in a format of policy recommendations or key steps.
I would say take a deep breath, wait for the 15th of June, hope that the first chapter is opened, and put a lot of your energy into all of the reforms in the reform plan that are linked to that first chapter.
Yeah, I cannot add anything to that, because we have recently published, the government has recently published this National Plan of Adaptation of Ukrainian legislation to the EU acquis. It kind of consolidated all of our obligations related to the European integration. It's super ambitious. Like, I'm looking forward to see what's going to happen within the next year. But yeah, probably I cannot add anything valid to what Matthias said already.
Thank you very much then for participating in our podcast episode. We were delighted to have you as speakers, and we look forward to our future engagements. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
This was the third episode of Advanced EU EUA podcast series, dedicated to the functioning of Ukraine facility mechanism. Follow us and stay tuned for more.